won't turn ugly and that they'll find an agreement. Certainly, we've had positive signs on both sides of the aisle. President Biden then flying back and cutting short, of course, his trip to Asia. European stocks gained some 0.4%. That's really led by some of the basic resources. Now, Bloomberg has learned that the G7 will increase pressure on Russia with extra sanctions and restrictions on goods. That's as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is said to be joining world leaders at the G7 in Hiroshima. Let's bring in Bloomberg's chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, in Hiroshima. Stephen, you're also at a pretty special place, which I know you'll tell us a little bit about, but what are the G7's next steps when it comes to sanctions?
Well, it's no coincidence that this G7 meeting hosted by Japan is being held in Hiroshima, referred to as the Peace City. Obviously, this is the atomic bomb dome. This was the epicenter of that first atomic bomb attack back in 1945, 78 years ago. And the G7 is trying to send that message, when we have a periodic threats of possible use of nuclear weapons by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. So they want to hammer home that point. And they also want to hammer home the unity that the G7 has in trying to contain the war machine of Russia. Yes, the Russian economy has suffered through these sanctions from the West. However, the war machine marches on, and they want to close off some of those loopholes that the Russians have been able to use to evade those first rounds of sanctions. And also they want to tighten or make another round, perhaps, of sanctions, including one that we got news of this morning about possibly tracking the gem trade, the lucrative gem trade exports out of Russia, including diamonds, highly lucrative for Moscow. But some in Europe, including the Belgians, have been opposed to that simply because if they cut off those exports, a lot of them go through Belgium. If they cut them off, they'll simply go to other jurisdictions. So at least the G7 is saying they're going to track cross-border Russian gem trade, and then perhaps that is a precursor to an all-out ban later on. The UK also unilaterally announced that they're going to ban imports of Russian nickel. So there's a number of different moves. But behind the scenes, in the conference centers where the G7 leaders are meeting, they are talking about the various measures that they can take to really punish Moscow for its continued war in Ukraine. And yes, we are learning from sources that Zelensky of Ukraine will be coming here on Sunday after a stop in Saudi Arabia for the Arab League summit. He could potentially be in the same room as Syria's Assad. That would be interesting, to say the least, this weekend. But again, he will be here at the Atomic Bomb Dome and the Peace Memorial Park just down the river here to make his case to get the G7s perhaps give more aid for Ukraine's fight against Russia.
Yeah, really fascinating that Zelensky is going to be there in person, again, according to Bloomberg reporting, after we had expected a virtual attendance by, of course, the leader of Ukraine. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. Fantastic stuff on the ground for us, Stephen Engel, in that historic location, of course, in Hiroshima. And Steve will be across all things G7 over the next couple of days. Coming up, oil is set for its best week since mid-April on US debt deal optimism. We're going to bring you the latest on the commodity space and some really important analysis from Bank of America. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
to the Open, everyone. 30 minutes into the European trading day, and here are your top stories. President Biden urges on his negotiating team as House Speaker McCarthy signals a debt ceiling deal could be struck this weekend. European stocks and U.S. futures are up. Well, G7 leaders are meeting in Japan as they weigh more curbs on Russia. Sources tell Bloomberg Vladimir Zelensky will attend. We're live in Hiroshima. Plus, the Fed officials sound increasingly split over policy at next month's meeting, prompting traders to lift bet for a hike. I think we heard from Lori Logan really throwing a curveball, actually, on what inflation's expected to.
Indeed, and we saw the yields move higher on that 4.2 at the front end on the US 2-year on the back of the comments from the Dallas Fed president suggesting that she is in no way positioned for a pause come June. So that certainly saw a market reaction. Of course, the debt ceiling debate, the mood music, the positive sentiment coming from both sides that a deal is close. Of course, there is still some work to be done there, but that optimism lifting the S&P to 9-month highs, the Nasdaq also ending higher, and the optimism remains in the European session, pushing past the downside that we're seeing in Hong Kong, particularly on the tech side of things, where you've seen losses of about 2%. Here in Europe, gains of 0.4%. The DAX adding 55 points. The FTSE 100 benefiting from a lift in terms of copper and oil, even as iron ore is down in the session. The FTSE 100 up 0.3%. Across the sectors then, at the top of the list, financial services gaining a 1.3%. Basic resources tying into that copper and oil story gaining 1.3%. Two sectors in the red this Friday morning. Then telecoms down 0.3%, and personal care currently just off by about 0.1%. Fran.
Now, Tom, oil heading for its first weekly advance in more than a month on optimism that the U.S. will avert a debt default. Joining us for more is Bank of America Global Research, Head of Global Commodities and Derivatives Research, Francisco Plant. Francisco, as always, it's so good actually to have you in London. So welcome to our lovely London studio. We had the IEA report just 2 days ago, and it was very clear that, look, that they're expecting stronger demand overall or stronger oil market because of demand growth. But because of the weakness that we've seen, how strong do you think that demand will be?
So this is, I think, a very important question heading into the second half of the year. We've seen OPEC taking supply out of the market 3 times now. Yeah. September last year, October, and then more recently in early April. And part of it, I think, is just the demand momentum has been slowing down. We've seen slower growth in the developed economies because of the higher interest rates. But also the China reopening hasn't been quite as, let's say, fast and furious as we initially anticipated. And part of it, I think, is I think the Chinese leadership, the Chinese Communist Party, is afraid of what they saw here and what they saw in the U.S. Double-digit inflation for China, given its setup, would be potentially quite dangerous, right? So I think the reopening is proceeding with a lot more caution there than we all thought, and that's where the demand story might be a little weaker. And then on top of that, you have an industrial recession, right? We've had very weak industry, even though services are really top of the line. So we've seen strong growth in leisure, hospitality, healthcare, education. So all the services are really booming, but it's just industry is also weak. So those are the 2 points, I think, where oil has really failed to turn around and get stronger.
Yeah, certainly that split picture in Europe has come through, hasn't it, in terms of services versus manufacturing. Services doing very well. And again, on the China story, the